morning. Let's read Chapter 5, Warehouse Crash. Clint Hill's footprints, Joe exclaimed. How do you know, Jerry? The head of our company, Mr. Allen, was very fond of Clint, the pilot explained. Shortly before he was lost in a crash at sea, the hangar floor was resurfaced with new concrete. Mr. Allen, perhaps partly in fun, asked Clint to make the prints. I wasn't here at the time, but it's a well-known story around the flight department. The Hardys studied the prints carefully. They noticed that the instep of the right foot was narrower than that of the left. The policeman, who had to get back to his regular duties, said goodbye. Jerry watched his young detective friends as they continued their study of the prints. I saw something just before I met you fellows that perhaps I should tell you, he said. What's that? Frank asked. A man's arm reached in through the door and placed that board over the prints, Jerry explained. That's funny, Frank commented. Jerry went on. I didn't attach any importance to it at the time. In fact, I'd forgotten about it until I saw how interested you were in those prints. Maybe the person is still around. The boys dashed outside the hangar but saw no one. We've heard of Clint Hill a couple of times today, Joe told Jerry, but did not explain further. After requesting Jerry to keep his eyes open and report to the Hardys any unusual goings-on around the hangar, the boys left for home. Both were quiet, pondering over all that had happened during their visit to the hangar. Why had Hill's footprints been covered? Was it to make certain the boys would not see them? And who had reported the presence of two prowlers to the police? Then there was the mechanic, Mike Zim. Had he been the man who had eavesdropped on their conversation? The case, the boys agreed, was becoming even more puzzling. During supper, they related their day's adventures to the family. Mighty queer business, Aunt Gertrude commented. You boys had better watch your step. I don't know what we're coming to when a company's employees can't walk around its private hangar without someone setting the police on them. The boys and their parents smiled. They were used to Aunt Gertrude's outbursts. Frank and Joe assured her they would try to duck any danger. The next morning, Thursday, the boys arose early for an early breakfast, eager to start their work in the Stanwide factory. Dressed in light khaki work pants and shirts, and equipped with appetizing lunches prepared by their mother and Aunt Gertrude, they drove off to the plant. Frank and Joe reported to their boss, Art Rodax, exactly on time. Apparently, this wasn't good enough. I want all new workers in my department to be here 20 minutes early, Rodax growled. Is that a company rule? Joe asked in surprise. It's my rule, Rodax announced angrily. Break it just once and you're out. He then thrust two large handfuls of work orders at Frank and Joe. You got 30 minutes to deliver these and get back here, he bellowed. The boys moved quickly and just managed to return on time. Rodax appeared to be disappointed. He had underestimated the Hardys' efficiency. To make their task harder, he gave them a number of other chores in addition to their regular duties. That evening, the brothers went to bed immediately after supper, completely exhausted. Their second day on the job didn't differ much from the first. Frank and Joe noticed that the other employees of the department were given little to do. Good thing the weekend's coming up, Joe grumbled. The way Rodax drives us, he could have had all of the Cape Kennedy gantries finished in 2 weeks. What bothers me most, Frank complained, is that we're not getting much of an opportunity to investigate. Yet the boys didn't want to report the situation to Mr. Allen. There would be little the executive could do to help, they thought, without arousing suspicion. Monday, the young detectives had an unexpected change in luck. Rodax was assigned for the day to another section of the factory to help supervise the installation of a new duplicating machine. Grateful to have comparative freedom, even just for the short time, the boys divided the work orders assigned them. Meet me in the warehouse at lunch hour, said Frank. We can compare notes then, and at the same time look around the building. See you there about 12 o'clock, Joe answered as he picked up a bundle of the orders and started off on his rounds. Both boys watched carefully for anything suspicious in each department they visited. Not a single clue was uncovered to the mystery of the disappearance of Stanwide's platinum components. A few minutes past noon, Frank and Joe greeted each other in the firm's large warehouse. It was divided into 2 main sections for incoming and outgoing shipments. Stacks of cardboard boxes and wooden crates towered almost to the ceiling. There were also several pieces of heavy machinery stored along one wall in a neat row. The Hardys found a wooden crate and sat down side by side to eat their lunches. They glanced around to make sure there were no other workers about. The only sound was the steady hum of the warehouse's ventilating system. As a precaution, the boys spoke in low voices. "Did you have any luck?" Frank queried. "I didn't come up with a single clue," Joe sighed with disappointment. "I didn't find anything either," Frank confessed. He told Joe he had investigated the handling of the shipments from beginning to end, even to checking the bills of lading to see if they'd been tampered with. His examination had revealed nothing. "Whoever's running this platinum racket is a slick operator," Joe remarked. Unheard by the boys over the hum of the ventilating system, an overhead hoist was being put into operation. It was only a short distance behind the two young detectives. A heavy piece of machinery was slowly lifted off the floor, then edged to a position directly above Frank and Joe. Suddenly the boys were startled to hear the sharp metallic snap of a release clutch. This was immediately followed by a deep whirling sound directly above them. Frank and Joe looked up instantly. A massive bulk of metal was plunging toward them. The boys made a frantic leap and went tumbling across the floor. The hurtling object pulverized the crate on which they'd been seated and sent splinters of wood and metal in all directions. "That was close!" Joe exclaimed. Frank said grimly, "Someone did that on purpose." As the boys scrambled to their feet, a door slammed violently at the far end of the warehouse. The Hardys ran to the door and flung it open. No one was in sight. They hurried outside and were about to search the area when they were confronted by a company guard. "Hold it," he ordered. "What's going on here?" "Did you see anyone run from the warehouse just now?" asked Frank. "No one but you two," the guard retorted. "I thought I heard a loud crash inside the building. What happened?" The boys told him of the incident and added that immediately after the crash they'd heard someone fleeing from the building. The guard eyed them with suspicion. "We'd better go inside and take a look." So here's the massive crash about to come down. Frank and Joe were annoyed at being delayed, but had no choice in the matter. The man herded them into the warehouse and peered down at the huge, twisted piece of machinery on the floor. It had not only crushed the wooden crate, but it embedded itself deep in the concrete floor. "What's the big idea of lying about this?" he thundered. "You caused this accident, but you're blaming it on someone else." "We had nothing to do with it," Joe protested angrily, "and besides, we might have been killed. We were sitting on that very crate." "Oh, yeah?" the guard sneered. Frank looked hard at the man. "We demand to see Mr. Allen," he said. "The head of the company?" the guard asked. "Fine chance of that. Mr. Allen's a busy man. He wouldn't have time to talk to a couple of kids." "I wouldn't be too sure of that," Joe warned. The guard was bewildered by the demand. He broke into a nervous grin. "We don't have to bother Mr. Allen," he said. "Somebody might lose his job because of this. Besides, this equipment's being discarded. Let's just forget the whole thing." The young detectives did not answer. They left the warehouse and returned to their jobs. "That guard certainly changed his attitude in a hurry when we asked to see Mr. Allen," Joe remarked. "Perhaps he's afraid he'd lose his own job for not keeping a closer eye on things," Frank suggested. "After what happened, we'd better watch our step around here." After supper that evening, Frank and Joe joined their father in his study. The boys told him about their narrow escape and of their failure to uncover any clues. "I'm sure our real reason for working at Stanwhite is suspected," said Frank. Mr. Hardy agreed and added, "As long as you continue to work at Stanwhite, the thieves will probably lie low, and you won't learn anything. Besides, it's too dangerous for you there. Your close call in the warehouse sounds as if the thieves are already trying desperately to get rid of you." The sleuth advised his sons to report to Mr. Allen everything that had happened, then resign their jobs. "Work on the case from the outside," he advised. "I'll arrange to obtain a clearance for you at the airport so you can roam around, just like regular personnel." Frank smiled. "Then we'll have lots of time to keep a close watch on Stanwhite's hangar." Joe nodded. "And also, I'd like to investigate the wooded area where we saw Bush Barney. That mystery hasn't been solved." Good idea, Frank replied. And let's make our first look an overall one, from the air. Chapter 6. Aerial Mission. The meteorologist at the airport says it should be clear tomorrow, Frank announced as he put down the telephone. I'll call Ace Air Service first thing in the morning and arrange to schedule an airplane, said Mr. Hardy. What time do you boys want to take off? We plan to photograph the wooded area with our aerial camera, Frank answered. If we arrive there shortly after 12 o'clock, the sun will be almost directly overhead. There won't be any shadows from the trees and other objects. Good thinking, Mr. Hardy said approvingly. You'll be less likely to miss important details that might be hidden if there were shadows. The investigator said that, meanwhile, he would check into the ownership of the land. If it is private property, said Joe, I doubt it belongs to that fellow who chased us. At that instant Aunt Gertrude entered the study carrying a large tray of brownies and lemonade. She placed it on Mr. Hardy's desk. I'm sure you can all forget about your new case long enough to have a snack, she said in a cajoling voice. Frank and I have to watch what we eat, Joe said jokingly. We don't want to get airsick tomorrow. Airsick? The tall woman exclaimed, her eyes opening wider. My word, so you boys intend to go flying around in a bouncy plane? We're just going up to take some pictures of crooks, said Frank, grinning. Isn't your detective work dangerous enough here on the ground? Aunt Gertrude asked sharply. Mr. Hardy reached out and patted his sister on the shoulder. Doing detective work while flying isn't any more of a risk than it is while riding in a car, he told her reassuringly. But Miss Hardy was not convinced. At least in an automobile, she sighed. You can get out and walk if the motor stops. Shaking her head, she left the study. By the way, said Mr. Hardy, a fellow from the Bayport Control Tower delivered a small package for you boys this morning. He extracted a set of keys from his pocket, unlocked his desk drawer, and took out the package. Frank eagerly opened it while Joe went to fetch their tape recorder. This, Frank explained, is the tape containing the conversation between the control tower and someone who sounds like Clint Hill. I thought if we listened to the recording several times, we might be able to identify the ghost as one of our suspects. At that moment, a stout, cheerful-looking boy strolled into the study. Hi, Chet! The Hardys grinned at the new arrival. Good-natured Chet Morton was one of Frank and Joe's best pals. Although comfort-loving and not fond of danger, he was loyal and had often helped the brothers in solving mysteries. Hi, everyone, Chet responded. Spotting the tray of refreshments, he eyed them hungrily. You're just in time for a little snack, said Frank, chuckling. Their friend's large appetite was well known to all. Thanks. I thought I'd stop by and see what you and Joe were up to. Just then Joe returned with the recorder. Frank put the tape on the machine and snapped the start switch. Seconds later, a ghostly voice issued from the speaker. What is that? Queried Chet with a look of genuine astonishment. You're listening to a ghost, Joe grinned. Ghost? Chet replied scornfully. That caterwauling wouldn't even scare a nervous cat. They played the tape several times. Chet tried to imitate the voice. The dead can tell no tales, said the tape. The dead can tell no tales, Chet repeated. That's a pretty good imitation, Frank laughed. Maybe you can get work haunting houses. The Hardys listened to the tape a few more times, but they were unable to associate the ghost with any of the suspects they'd encountered. Chet, who by now had consumed most of the brownies, glanced at his watch and announced it was time for him to go home. As he left the study, the boys were amused to hear him mumbling, The dead can tell no tales. Tell no tales. The next morning, Frank and Joe drove to the Stanwide Mining Equipment Company. Mr. Allen welcomed them with a smile as they entered his office. How's the case been coming? He asked. Have you managed to uncover any clues? We haven't found much to go on, Frank said regretfully. The boys told him about their visit to the Stanwide hangar and described all that had happened during their masquerade as employees. Mr. Allen expressed deep concern over their narrow escape in the warehouse. The Hardys said they were certain that somehow information had leaked out as to their real reasons for working in the plant. He agreed that it might be too dangerous for them to continue their undercover work there. I'm disturbed to hear about Art Rodax's conduct, Mr. Allen declared. I won't have a man of his character working for my company. I suggest you say nothing to him, Frank urged. Every one of your employees is a suspect at present. If Rodax is fired, it may spoil our chances of getting to the bottom of the platinum thefts. Frank also pointed out that it would be unwise for Joe and himself to resign suddenly from their jobs. This might make it appear that their investigation had uncovered some clues, and would put whoever was involved in the thefts doubly on guard. Then what will you do? Mr. Allen asked. We'll get ourselves fired, said Frank. How? His brother questioned. From the beginning, Rodax has resented our being hired, Frank said. Maybe it's because he's mixed up in the racket and he knows about us. Anyway, I'm willing to bet he wouldn't need much of an excuse to fire us. Frank glanced at his wristwatch. You know how fussy he is about having us report for work 20 minutes early. Well, now we're nearly an hour late. That should do it. After telling Mr. Allen that they would keep him posted on any new developments in the case, the young detectives went off to the messenger department. When they came face to face with Rodax, Frank could see that his plan was working out even better than he'd expected. Do you know what time it is? Shouted Rodax. Although he seemed furious, the boys could sense that he was actually pleased with the situation. We couldn't get here any earlier, said Joe. You don't have to worry about that anymore, Rodax bellowed. You're fired. The boys pretended to be angry and concerned. We'll report this to the main office, Frank blazed. Go ahead, Rodax yells. See how far that will get you. He turned and stalked off with a self-satisfied air. The boys left the factory and started for the airfield. On the way, they discussed Rodax briefly. I wonder how pleased old Sourface would be, Joe remarked, if he realized he'd played right into our hands. A few minutes later, the Hardys were walking toward a small frame building. A sign reading Ace Air Service spanned its entire width along the roof. Another small sign, Office and Operations, hung above the doorway. On the aircraft parking ramp, the boys saw 3 single-engine and 2 multi-engine aircraft bearing the firm's name. As they entered the building, a voice called to them. Frank and Joe Hardy? The boys turned to see a tall, lean man walking toward them. He wore a tan cloth jacket and sunglasses with green-tinted lenses. He extended his hand in greeting. I'm Randy Watson, he said. I fly for Ace Air Service. I have a plane all set. The pilot added he'd often flown their father on trips. I've heard a lot about you fellows, he added, smiling. Are you on a case or just going on a sightseeing ride? Before answering, Frank walked over to a large aeronautical chart attached to the wall. With his finger, he circled an area colored in shades of light green and brown northwest of Bayport. We want to take some aerial photographs in this locale, he said. Joe and I are sure we spotted an ex-convict there. We're curious to know what he's up to. Randy stepped close to the chart and estimated the distance between Bayport and the area Frank had indicated. That's not far by air, he observed. We can use one of the single-engine ships. We'd like to reach the area about noon, said Frank. The pilot checked his wristwatch. That means we'll have to take off within the next 10 or 15 minutes. Joe hurried to the airport restaurant to order sandwiches and milk for their lunch, while Frank returned to the brothers' car to pick up the aerial camera and films. The boys reached the flight line just as Randy was completing the pre-flight check of the aircraft. In a few minutes, they were strapped in their seats and taxiing toward the active runway. The pilot remarked, Because of the direction of the wind, that runway is the only one I can use ahead. Because of the direction of the wind, that runway is the only one I can use to head the plane into the wind. He tuned his radio to the proper frequency and contacted Bayport Tower. An immediate reply crackled from the plane's receiver. Ace Service Flight 26 is cleared to runway 19er. Winds from the southeast at 15 knots. Altimeter setting 2986. Randy paused to check his instruments, controls, and engine magnetos. The tower then cleared him for immediate takeoff. Turning into the runway, he eased the throttle ahead. Soon he and his passengers were airborne and taking a course to the northwest. The boys gazed down at the earth below. The terrain became more hilly with each passing mile. The expanses of wooded areas looked like rumpled, deep green carpet. Here and there, lakes and small streams reflected the sun in bright flashes, almost blinding in their intensity. The pilot adjusted his course, checked his watch against the small clock mounted on the instrument panel, then said to Frank and Joe, "We should be coming up on the area you're looking for in a few minutes." The Hardys scanned the surface below more intently. Far to the left, Frank saw a narrow ribbon of paved road that he surmised to be the highway from which he and Joe had turned onto the secondary road. Frank requested the pilot to fly closer to the highway. "There it is," Joe declared. "That must be the secondary road we drove along." Frank peered directly downward. The road itself was not visible, but a telltale cleft that snaked along the trees told him it was there. Randy banked steeply to the right and paralleled the road. "Can we fly lower?" Frank asked. Randy examined the terrain. "It seems to be pretty desolate. I think we can drop to a lower altitude without breaking any air regulations." The pilot eased back on the power and allowed the nose of the airplane to drop a few degrees below the horizon. The large hand of the altimeter slowly moved counterclockwise, indicating a descent. Randy leveled out at about 500 feet, skillfully avoiding the hills. The cleft in the trees grew wider, bringing the road into view. "Look!" Joe yelled. "That's where our car turned over. The saplings we used for leverage are still there." "Start taking pictures," Frank ordered. "I'll keep an eye out for anything of special interest." Joe gripped the camera and pointed it downward. Randy banked the plane so the young detectives could take a more direct aim. Joe made several exposures as the pilot circled the area, gradually widening his turns. "I just spotted something!" Frank shouted. "What is it?" Joe readied the camera. "It looks like the roof of a small cabin," Frank replied. "If the sun weren't directly overhead, it would be hidden in the shadows. It's surrounded by trees and brush." "I see it!" exclaimed Joe. He focused the camera and released the shutter. "The cabin is near the spot where we saw Bush Barney," Frank declared. "Do you think he could be hiding out there?" Joe questioned. "It's possible, and perhaps our friend with the shotgun, too." The pilot rolled out of the turn. "We'll fly straight and level for a few seconds," he said. If we continue those tight turns for too long, we might get vertigo." Their straight course took them over an area on the opposite side of the road. Frank suddenly noticed a rectangular-shaped field that looked like a pasture. "Fly over that way," he said to Randy, pointing almost directly ahead. The pilot eased the plane into a course around the narrow clearing. Frank and Joe saw that the grassy field was bordered by trees and dense brush. At one end loomed a high, steep hill. "What do you make of it?" Frank asked, glancing at the pilot. "Do you think a small plane could land there and take off?" "I doubt it," Randy said, "but let's go down for a closer look and see." He dropped the plane's nose steeply, pulling out over the clearing below tree level. He carefully dragged the field, then applied full power and turned sharply away from the steep hill ahead. "That clearing's only about 900 feet long," he told the boys. "The approaches are very bad. I doubt whether anyone could get a plane in there without rolling it up into a ball. And even if a landing were possible, he'd never be able to take off again." The boys' thoughts turned back to the airplane they'd encountered on the road. If it had crashed, where was the wreckage? It must have pulled up and gone off. Did the roadblock and the red flare have something to do with the maneuver? Frank took over with the camera. Quickly reloading it, he photographed the open area. Joe peered through his binoculars. Suddenly he snapped up in his seat. "Down in the clearing!" he shouted. "See those two men stalking along the edge?" The pilot banked the plane and lined up for another low pass. As they approached, Frank also spotted the two figures. Joe focused his binoculars more sharply. "I'm not sure," he yelled excitedly, "but I think one of those men is Bush Barney." As the plane roared closer, the two men whirled around. They glanced up, then turned and ran into the woods. "Quick!" Frank shouted to Randy. "Pull around and make another low pass." The pilot again pulled up steeply to turn away from the hill ahead, but just as he pushed the throttle forward for more power, the engine suddenly sputtered, then quit completely. Randy immediately dropped the nose in an effort to keep flying speed and avoid a stall. The boys looked ahead. Through the windshield all they could see was a formidable array of trees, dense brush, and hills strewn with rocks and boulders. They tightened their seat belts and braced themselves for the worst. There was no place to land. They would have to crash.